Hello, everyone. If you want to tackle bread making and you're a little intimidated by it, you've never made it before, or you tried it once and it didn't work out, then you've come to the right place. I'm going to show you guys how to make my favorite whole wheat sandwich loaf. You use all of these ingredients that you see here, which are all pantry staples, so it's a nice dish to make. This is whole wheat flour, and this is bread flour that is white bread flour. We're going to use a 50-50 mix of both of these flours. You can use 100% whole wheat flour, but that loaf is going to be a lot denser than if you use both of these flours together. I'm using some evaporated canned milk. You can, of course, use fresh milk if you have it, but if you don't worry. Just use some canned milk and water. You also need a little sugar or honey, any kind of sweetener, and yeast. You definitely need some yeast, and hopefully you can find some at the store right now. This is some salt, and this is the only like non-shelf stable ingredient in the loaf. It's butter. You could use margarine, you can use oil. Anyway, you start with some yeast. The full recipe amounts are in the video description below, so check that out for the amounts. But you want to start with your yeast, and I like to use a giant Pyrex container, but a bowl is fine. To that, we're going to add just a little bit of water. And what this will do is it will show us if your yeast is alive or dead. If you recently bought that yeast, it's definitely alive, but this is just a nice fail-safe method. If it foams up a little bit in a few minutes, it's alive. Meanwhile, I'm going to get the milk mixture. So this is actually a quarter of a cup of canned milk, and then it's filled up the rest of the way with water. The original recipe is half a cup of milk and half a cup of water, but since I'm using canned milk, I adjusted the ratios a little bit. Anyway, we're going to warm this up in the microwave to 110 degrees. If you don't have a thermometer, which you might not, don't worry. Just warm it up so it's a little bit warm, like a little bit warmer than the inside of your mouth. I put a little pat of butter in there because we want the butter to be soft as well. So I'm just going to microwave that all together. So I have a nice thermometer, and it's reading just below 110, so that's perfect. But again, if you don't have a thermometer, err on the side of not hot enough, because if it's too hot, you will kill your yeast. So I'd say just make it slightly warmer than the inside of your mouth, and it should be a pretty good temperature. And if that really scares you, just use room temperature. It's totally fine. It'll just take longer to rise. So I like to add the sugar to this warm mixture so that it dissolves a little bit. And I'm also adding the salt so that it dissolves. And you don't have to be super careful about it all dissolving. See, it's alive because it's all frothy looking. So you pour that warm liquid mixture to the yeast and just stir to incorporate. Again, don't worry if it's not perfect. Like, see, there's lumps of yeast, there's a lump of butter still in there. It'll all work out when we need it later. So I start by adding all of the whole wheat flour. And it's a little more than a cup here. And I mix in all of the whole wheat flour first. Whole wheat flour does not have as much gluten as white flour. It hydrates a lot differently. Hydrating is basically how the water and the wheat and the flour just combine together to become a homogeneous mix. So I add the wheat flour first, the whole wheat flour, and it makes this looks kind of like a cake batter at this point. This is a little bit less than half of the flour that we're adding to the whole loaf. And now I'm starting to add the white bread flour or the strong flour. And I don't add it all at once. I add like about 2/3 of it first at this stage and stir it with, I like to use this just heavy duty spatula because it's really nice to scrape the bowl as I stir. It's a lot easier if you're not holding a camera with your one free hand. It's much easier if you use that free hand to hold the bowl in place while you stir. But if you're holding a camera as I am, then just do your best to try to stir it. But once it gets to the point that you can't stir it anymore with a stirrer, I like to dump it onto a cutting board and knead it. Now, as I knead on the cutting board, I'm going to be adding the rest of the flour little by little, and I'm basically going to knead it for 10 whole minutes, or until my hands and the cutting board are no longer sticky. You're going to see me releasing the stick as I knead, and you're going to see me adding some flour as I knead.
Okay, so I wanted to keep this clip solid. I didn't want to make any cuts or fast forward because I wanted to show you guys how long it actually takes to properly knead this loaf of bread. And it takes a lot longer than you think, and that's why I really am an advocate for setting your timer when you are kneading bread, just to make sure that you knead it for the proper amount of time. Now, if you do have a KitchenAid, a stand mixer, that can knead the bread for you, saves a lot of time and arm pain. But if you are poor like I am, or live in a tiny apartment like I do and don't have room for a stand mixer, then just do it by hand. It's all good. So anyway, I asked you guys, community, and my friends in real life to ask me questions about beginning level bread making so that I could fill this 10 minutes with something a little more interesting than just a 10-minute shot of me literally just kneading bread. So anyway, here's the first question. Any tips for how to tell when bread is done baking? So the very common way, if you don't have a thermometer or anything else, you just flip the loaf over out of the pan. It should release quite easily. And then just tap the underside of it. And if it sounds hollow, then it's done. If it does not sound hollow, it is not done. When in doubt, like if this is your first loaf, it might be if you're watching this video, basically, it's better to overbake your bread than underbake it. Underbaked bread is kind of doughy and gross in the center. I mean, you could salvage that by toasting it afterwards, like making it into toast. But it's kind of hard to come back from if it's like raw in the center. If it's overbaked, it's just going to be a little on the drier side, and, and then in that case, also make toast out of it. Those are pretty much the two ways of solving bread. Overbaked bread, also, you could turn it into bread pudding later to save it, to salvage it. Where can I buy yeast? Yeah, who knows? Nowadays, if you're watching this video long after it was uploaded, go to the grocery store and you can buy yeast there. But nowadays it's a gamble. The last time I was at the grocery store, I think they did have some yeast, but they didn't have any flour, so, good luck. You can do sourdough bread if you have a lot of flour. You can make your own starter. And I also read recently that you can make your own yeast by peeling fruit and then putting it in water. I've never done that before, but look it up. And I think you can do that. How are you guys hanging in there during all of this? I feel like I'm starting to lose my mind. I had surgery in February 20th, so I have basically been quarantined since then. Oh, dude, sorry, that sucks. Yeah, my husband actually almost had surgery. We went to the hospital for a consultation on, it was the second Tuesday in March. So it was right before our governor put that, and it was a week or so before our governor put the shelter in place order. So he almost had surgery. And I was thinking about it at the time too. God, what if we start quarantining, and what if that happens when he's in the hospital, because then he'll have to be quarantined there for a long time. But thankfully they canceled the surgery. How are we hanging in there? Actually pretty well. Almost every day we remark over how lucky we are that I work at home and that I haven't really, I've kind of lost a little work since the onset of this, but it's actually, I think, more because of the time of year that it is. My translation work always goes down this time of year. So yeah, we have each other. We love hanging out with each other. We're homebodies anyway. We don't really like going out. So our lives actually have not changed that much. So we're actually hanging in there pretty well. What is with the Windowpane test? So the Windowpane test is when you can stretch your bread dough so that you can see through it. Basically, that's the idea of your bread dough itself is like a window. It becomes translucent if you stretch it thinly. That's one way of being able to tell how ready your dough is, how developed the gluten is. If the gluten is not very developed, if you stretch your dough thin, it's just going to snap and break. But if you've kneaded it and developed enough gluten, you should be able to stretch it pretty thin without it snapping. That's kind of what Windowpane test is. It just means that you've developed enough gluten. And some people also say you should be able to read a newspaper through it. I don't know. Don't worry too much about those sorts of tests. I would just say, if this is your first rodeo, if this is your first time making bread and you just need to get your feet wet, don't worry too much about all these very specific, nitpicky, fine-tuning things about bread making. I'd say if you knead it for 10 minutes or as long as the recipe says you're supposed to knead it, you're going to have some success. You're not necessarily going to make the best version of that loaf of bread ever, but you're going to make a good version of that loaf of bread. What are the lines on the top for? So he meant the score lines on top of some loaves. I actually don't know. I think it's for steam, but it's also aesthetic. How do you keep the cut end from getting stale between slices? I always wrap mine up in a used plastic bag. Plastic wrap also works as well. Why do we need the dough? To develop gluten. And what that does, really, developing the gluten, is it gives the bread its really nice chewy texture. If you don't develop any gluten, it's kind of like cakey, I guess. It's just not very bready. Is there a substitute for yeast to help bread rise if I don't have some? Yeah, there's, the natural spores from the air, which is sourdough bread. There's collecting it from fruit scraps, like I read in that hack, but I personally don't know how that works. But also there's chemical leavening. There's baking soda and baking powder. Irish soda bread, you might have heard of. It's a good bread, and that's a quick bread. It's risen with baking soda and acid instead of yeast. Also, like zucchini bread, cornbread, those are quick breads. They're risen with like baking powder and stuff. What makes bread flour and regular flour different? Bread flour, it's also called strong flour. It has like more gluten in it. And so if you tried to bake something like a cake with it, your cake would be kind of tough. But bread, often you want that tougher structure. Does the phrase pinching a loaf stem from something, or is it just a good way to say I have to poop? I don't know, but yeah, I like that latter one. It's a good way of saying I have to poop. How come store-bought bread is super soft and homemade bread tends to be stiffer? That can be a couple things. One, homemade bread, it depends on the loaf, for one thing. Like, certain loaves are just stiffer than others. But for another thing, store-bought bread has a lot of additives and chemicals and stuff in it that stabilize it and like make it lighter and fluffier and stuff. So a lot of it is that. If you buy bread from like a bakery, I've noticed, because I bought some bread from bakeries. If you're in Sacramento area, still Spencer Grateful Bread is a really good bread company. But anyway, yeah, their bread I've noticed tends to be stiffer and denser as well compared to like Oro wheat, like the very fluffy breads. But if you want your homemade bread to be like softer and fluffier, you should use the tangjong method. I actually have a video where I made the Japanese milk bread, or shokpan, and that uses the tangjong method. It's really weird, but it works pretty well to make your bread sort of lighter and fluffier and moister. What is a sourdough starter? I kind of answered that. How is it made? Yeah, so you add like flour and water, and then like all the natural spores from the air come into it. And then what you have to keep doing, I read about this, but I've never done it. You like have to keep discarding part of your starter and feeding it more flour. So it uses up a lot of flour. And then the parts that you discard, a lot of people just throw that away. But you can turn it into like King Arthur flour. I'll put a link to their website below. They talk about sourdough bread. That's pretty much where I learned everything I know about sourdough bread, because I've never made it myself. But they have a lot of recipes for what to do with bits of your starter that did not become a full starter. They have like cracker recipes, a carrot cake recipe. There's a lot of things you can do with your leftover bits of starter. But yeah, you have to keep feeding it flour. I'm not going to answer any of the more questions about sourdough bread because I really don't know. I've never made it myself. And then what type of bread is worth outrunning a to-the-letter officer of the law for most of your life? Yeah, I have to confess, I am not the biggest fan of bread. I guess it's more one of those things where like it has to be really, really good bread. If it's freshly baked or well-made bread, then I really, really like it. And like any loaf, if it's freshly baked and really good, it's really good bread. And it depends on what mood I'm in. Like if I want something like zingy and vinegary, like if I want to enjoy nice sausage or like some like pastrami and mustard, then rye is amazing. Sometimes like rye bread with German mustard and sausage is one of my favorite things to eat in the summer. If I'm in the mood for sweet, brioche, of course, is awesome. Challah is a nice, like much easier to make than brioche. So if you want to make French toast or have some kind of sweet-ish bread, but you don't want to go through the trouble of making brioche because it's hard, challah is nice. But I really, really like this particular whole wheat bread that is in this video. Fresh baked out of the oven with butter and honey. It really can't be beat. So according to the clock on my camera viewfinder, I have been talking for 10 minutes now, so I'm probably finished kneading the bread by now. Hope you enjoyed this little Q&A session and watching me knead the bread this whole time.
Well, my 10 minutes of kneading are up and my hands are virtually clean. There's just a teeny tiny bit of dough sticking there, but for the most part, my hands are very clean. And that's one of your big indicators to show you how good a job you did of kneading that bread and if it's ready for its rise. It should feel like a giant wad of chewing gum, for lack of a better descriptor. It should be nice and smooth and not sticky. And that's how you know you're done. So I'm just going to take the same bowl that I mixed the dough in and I'm oiling it. Get it nice and oiled all the way around. It's okay if there's little bits of bread dough sticking to it. It doesn't have to be clean and perfect. Just make it nice and oiled and then plop the dough in there. And we're going to do what is called proofing it, which is basically just making it rise. And a nice hack if your kitchen is kind of cold like mine is, I turn my oven on and then the top of my oven gets rather warm when the oven is on. So I just put it on top of my oven and then cover it with, this is an old cut up tank top. You can use plastic bag or a towel or something. And basically you want to put this in a nice warm place. 80 degrees is ideal. So in the summertime, it's great to make bread. You just stick it outside. But this hack works in colder months. So an hour and a half later, it should double in size. If you started with a wetter milk mixture, you might need to do this for 2 hours. Basically rise it until it's doubled in size and then punch it down. That part's kind of fun and satisfying. And then briefly knead it, only for about 30 seconds to a minute. With this knead, you're just making it so there aren't any obvious like folds or pockets in your dough. As you're kneading it, you should feel like the yeast basically like farting while you're squishing the dough. This part's a lot of fun. And it should be nice and smooth and elastic and not sticky. And after you're finished with your brief knead, stick it right back into the same bowl and put it right back on top of your warm stove and cover with the plastic bag or the towel again and let it rise or proof for another hour. After your other hour, it should rise up again, and you're just going to punch it back down again. What we're doing here is we're actually developing some really good flavors. The yeast is fermenting a little bit more as we're doing this, so you don't have to rise it twice. If you're pressed for time, you can rise it once. And all of this is detailed in the video description notes where the recipe is printed out. But now, after I've kneaded it, I form it into a loaf shape, and I put it in a greased loaf pan. And you don't have to do what I'm doing right here, but I'm just kind of pressing it a little bit, just that's more the shape of the loaf pan. Again, you don't really have to do that, but I do it. And then once again, you put it in the warm place and you cover it with your towel or your plastic bag and let it rise again for another hour before you put it in the oven. After that hour is up, look at how puffed it is. It almost looks like just a baked loaf of bread, except it's very blonde in color. So at this point, you're going to put it in a 450-degree oven to bake for 10 minutes, and then you're going to lower the oven temperature to 350 to bake for an additional 30 minutes or until it is done. And as I described earlier, you'll know your bread is done when you flip it out of the pan. It should flip out of the pan very easily and tap it on the underside. It should sound hollow. Or if you do have an instant read thermometer, it should be 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's our loaf. It's beautiful, it's brown, and it is so tasty. If you've never done homemade bread before, you're in for a real treat. It makes the house smell delicious and it tastes really, really good. So after you get it out of the oven like this, you have to let it sit. It's best if you let it sit until it cools completely on a wire rack before cutting into it, but I like my bread nice and warm and fresh from the oven, so I sacrifice my future bread's texture a little bit by cutting into it. Look, the steam is still rising from it, but it's so delicious in this state, especially with a little bit of butter or honey. So that was my whole wheat sandwich bread, and I hope you guys try this out soon.